Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. For today's webinar, Leading a Trauma-Responsive School Culture, and I'm really excited that you could join us. My name is Michele Regan. I am a Senior Client Director at Inspired Instruction, and this is a topic that is very important to me, but also to our work here, because everything that we do obviously hinges on students' readiness to learn. And so we're going to dive in today to learn a little bit more about what a trauma responsive school culture looks like. Some of the takeaways that you will have today will be really guided um, or geared toward, administrators, school leaders, people who are involved in setting policies, systems, structures, but there will also be takeaways if anybody here is an instructional staff member, if you're a teacher or other instructional member of the school, that you'll have some specific takeaways. So I'm going to invite you to participate via the chat. Okay, so you can go down to the bar on the bottom and use the chat. Um, as interactive as possible, I think always helps. So as you have kind of aha moments or questions, please put them in the chat because I'm happy to answer them or to apply what we're talking about today directly to your school population. Okay, and with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so our agenda for today is to take a look at what trauma is and the impacts. And that's really critical because it's important that everybody in the building be aware of what the depth of a traumatic experience could look like in a student and then how that will show up in schools. And so you'll see the different kind of indicators that we can be on the lookout for to be aware if students are experiencing or have experienced trauma in their life. And then finally, school-wide practices that are things that, again, leaders can put into place, but certainly any educator, anybody working with students can also put these practices into place to create immediate impact. If we're going to create a trauma-responsive school, this is going to be change that occurs over time. But my hope today is that you'll get some questions answered and some starting points to begin that change in culture. Okay. So we want to take a look first at what is trauma, what are adverse childhood experiences. So you may have heard this phrase ACEs or heard this acronym ACEs, and that really references the various things that students may have experienced to put them in this place. And so really it's these ideas of severe stressors or situations such as abuse, neglect, any kind of household dysfunction. And those can either happen one time or repeated over time. So it's important that we recognize that even a one-time event could be considered a traumatic event and could have long-term impact on students, both their ability to show up in school as well as their long-term health and well-being. Okay, and what really makes it considered trauma is that the coping mechanisms that one would use to deal with particular stressful situations are no longer working. So these coping mechanisms can't meet the moment for these stressors. Okay, so that's important to understand what trauma actually is. The trauma is not the experience, the trauma is when we cannot cope. Okay. All righty. So let's take a look at what some of these ACEs might show up, what they might show up as in your schools. Okay, so these could be students that experienced, again, one time or over a period of time. I'm going to pop these up and I would like you to read them. I'm not going to read off each one, but I want you to think about what is showing up in your school population. Okay. So we're going to pause for a moment as you had an opportunity to watch these come into the screen. I think the important thing to note is that first off, this is not all inclusive. There are certainly other items that you could consider that would show up on this list. One that is not here, but is certainly super relevant is racism, right? Or kids who are exposed to ongoing prejudice or even things in their community where they're feeling marginalized. Okay. So important to keep in mind that there are other things. This is not all inclusive. The other thing to keep in mind is you noticed as this list got longer, you were probably thinking, most people aren't going to experience one of these because many of these have different implications. For example, if we look at number 5, if you're living with someone with an alcohol or a drug problem, they may be closely associated with someone experiencing depression or with someone who has witnessed or experienced violence in the home. Okay. So a lot of these, there's some relation. And so we also want to think about how many a student may have experienced. So we're going to look at that next as we walk through how many students are actually experiencing these and then what those outcomes might look like. Okay. So we know from a study done in 2016 that students 17 and under, about 45% experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. So think of that. Almost half of the population on any given day in your school may have experienced one of those ACEs. Now, keep in mind, I always want to remind people that since COVID, during that time, just the fact that we were isolated from those important protective factors in schools may have been traumatic in and of itself. The fact that kids were isolated from peers may also have been traumatic. So while that list does not include those items, those are also things to keep in mind. So this might be considered artificially low based on the fact that we all experienced that time during COVID. Okay, so 45% of kids 17 and under, this was from data 2016. And then the most recent data that we have comes from 2023. A nationwide study was done by the CDC. And this shocking number, 75% of high schoolers. Okay, so think about it this way. High schoolers were surveyed and they reported experiencing at least one ACE over the period of their lifetime. Okay, so that's a very jarring statistic. If you are a school leader and you're thinking about, even if you're not a high school leader, just the fact that you may have students in your elementary school that end up being in this list. So it's our role to do a couple of things. First is to identify these so that we're able to provide appropriate interventions and a safe relationship-based school, but also so that we can prevent secondary trauma. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right. So what's the big deal? So I want you to think about a time that you were stressed about something. And, this could have been a big thing. That feeling inside your body of being on edge, um, constant worry, not being able to concentrate on other things, the physical experiences that you have in your body, whether that's heart rate or whether that's sweaty palms or whether that's feeling sick to your stomach. Okay. So imagine those happening on a very long term basis. This is toxic stress. Okay. And that wear and tear that occurs on the physical body and on the brain, I think this image is so powerful. If you think about a car that's been revving for weeks, think about the wear and tear on that car, right? And a human and how much more vulnerable that we are. Think about the damage that can be done. Okay. And now think about them showing up at school. So whether that's a student or even an adult in your building showing up, having experienced ongoing toxic stress. How are they going to show up? Okay, what are the implications? So I just want to share this with you. I think again, visuals are so powerful, but these are brain scans of a healthy brain on the left-hand side and a brain that has been this child was in a Romanian orphanage and deprived of emotional attachment. Okay, so obviously this is a pretty severe experience, but I think it's really useful to demonstrate the actual structural changes that will happen in a brain. So you can see the bright red is all of the activity. And in this child's brain, there's very little red at all in this upper portion. Okay. And even the yellow is lacking and green in this section. So I think this visual is so powerful in understanding how toxic stress has long-term impacts. Okay. So we're going to talk today about what it looks like in school. There's additional research that talks about long-term health effects. So things like um, heart-related issues or possible use of substances. All of this is related. We're going to focus today on what it looks like in schools. I'm going to pause for a second. This is a lot of information, so I always want to make sure that if there are questions, I'm stopping to answer, or if anyone wants to share in chat anything that has resonated with them so far. If you're thinking about particular kids in your school building, or even staff members, or your own experience, I welcome you to share those because I think it makes it even more relevant to us when we can hear from our peers. So feel free to enter into chat any questions or any kind of aha moments for you as we speak today. And I'll continue to check that. Okay, so we want to take a look at how does this show up in schools? And everybody has heard about fight, flight, or freeze, but I want you to think about your student population. And if we go with the 2016 statistic, picture that half of them are potentially showing up in fight, flight, or freeze. Maybe not every day, maybe for a portion of the day, but think about what that means. Okay, so from an emotional standpoint, this means that our brain and our body is paying attention to those messages, constantly triggering the question, am I safe? Okay, so wondering about their surroundings, worrying about a change in routine. Okay, the emotional part of the brain is always going to be focused on safety and not necessarily learning. Okay, what about your physiological system? So this means things like heart rate increase, rapid breathing, increased blood pressure, lots of hormones going through your body like cortisol and adrenaline. So this could make kids, adults feel jumpy or on edge, or again, unable to focus because they're so focused on what's happening in the physical body. Okay. And then the cognitive part of the brain. So that fear response can immediately disrupt learning that's happening. So is a child going to be ready to learn if their cognitive system is being disrupted by these ongoing stressors? Okay. And if we think about the chronic exposure, that toxic stress, we think about that actual structures of the brain are altered. And so we're going to take a look at what that actually means. I want you to take note when we're in this next slide looking at, I'm going to call them symptoms or indicators, is when we're talking about creating a trauma responsive school culture, it's critical that everybody that works with students know these indicators. Okay. And so let's talk a little bit more because there's often confusion between what these symptoms really are telling us. Sometimes we think they're telling us that a student just doesn't feel like doing schoolwork today, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at this through a trauma sensitive lens. Okay, so let's take a look at this list. Okay, I'm going to pop these up. and I want you to think about particular students in your school. Okay, if I asked every single one of you to put in chat, is there at least one child that comes to mind when you see these indicators? I guarantee you would all say yes. Okay, we have, um, I could ask that a different way. I could ask how many students in any given class are presenting this way? Okay, so there is a real need for us to pay attention to what's showing up. And I just had someone share, of course, absolutely, we're all seeing students like this. And what's really, really important is that we take a second look, right? If we have a student with decreased attention, our first um, thought might be, oh, this kid has ADHD, they need to be referred to special education. Or this child spends too much time on their phone, and so now they're not used to school. All right. We might think kids are not motivated, right? So all of these things we want to take a second look at and consider, could a student be suffering from that trauma response? If you look at these as responses to those ACEs, it helps shift the way we then address it. Okay. Because oftentimes, let's look at this last bullet, disruptive behaviors. Oftentimes we approach these from a very reactive place, right? And so we want to stop the disruption. And so we either want to remove that student or provide a consequence. And what we want to think about is um, this behavior or this trauma response is due to something else. And so the way we respond needs to be a little bit different. Okay. So a big takeaway could be sharing these and having a discussion with your school team about these different indicators and share some different case studies in your school. You know, Johnny in such and such class is always looking at the door. He's getting up out of his seat in anticipation of things. Just that hypervigilant behavior of always worrying and being stressed. What is that about? Is that a trauma response? Okay. Okay. So let's look at what schools, let's try to make a comparison, what schools traditionally have done with some of these responses versus a trauma approach or a trauma responsive culture. So this first on the left-hand side is a traditional approach. We look at the behavior as the problem. Often we look at behavior as being purposeful, okay? Especially if you have a student who's bright and who you know can do the work. Okay. If you see a behavior happen, you might think, well, this student clearly knows what's going on here. There's some purposeful behavior happening here. We want to hold that for a minute and we're going to look at what the trauma responsive approach says. Okay. In this mode, we want the student to fix the problem. That means the student is typically given a consequence. Okay. The adult has total control, and our approach is generally more of a consequence based. Sometimes it can be punitive, but even if it's not punitive, if it's consequence based, it still has all the control. The adult still has all the control. Okay. Oftentimes, this is another key thing to think about is these types of students that are getting behavior referrals or mental health referrals. Typically, the responsibility is going to lie with a school counselor or mental health professional. And in a trauma responsive school culture, that is not the case. It is going to be a shared responsibility, a collaborative approach to each student. Okay. So the green box is your trauma responsive approach. So we want to shift the way we look at behavior and see that behavior as a coping mechanism. right? It is a replacement for the coping mechanism that is no longer effective or that was never there in the first place. Okay. And their behavior is a stress response and therefore it's automatic. And I think that can be a game changer just to consider if these behaviors are automatic and they've become a pattern and a routine for students, we're going to need to do some work to kind of break those patterns and help give them more effective behaviors in its place. And it's not going to be overnight. Okay. Instead, what do we want to start with? We want to start with looking at the environment and any interactions that could be a trigger. Okay. For that student that I mentioned is hypervigilant, we're going to want to think about what are the things during the day that are unpredictable. Is there a way we can tighten up our routine to create more predictability and consistency? All right, I'm going to see. I think I just saw a question came in. So the question said, when I present regarding trauma-informed care in the classroom, I always stress behavior as communication. Absolutely. Any behavior, we should always be wondering and asking why. What is the student trying to communicate to us? Why is this behavior showing up? So thank you so much for pointing that out. That message alone can be a game changer for teachers. Okay, so they're going to start with looking at the environment and any interactions that could be potential triggers for students. Okay, that's first and foremost. Then we want to consider how do we offer choice and flexibility. So this doesn't mean we don't give some sort of consequence. However, could we offer choices? Could the student be given a choice to go to a calm corner? Could the student be given a choice to write in a journal? So something that's going to actually deal with the stress response. Okay. Also having flexibility in what your behavioral approach is. We can't have a one size fits all approach. We need to consider each student uniquely and what their experiences are. If you have a student that is, more aggressive, we're going to really want to think about, what is the best approach for giving that student a consequence? Is it going to be something that's going to create more aggression? Okay. Okay, and I see a mistake here where it says adults have total control. That is supposed to be adults have some control, but students also have control. So I'm sorry for that error. Just trying to see if everybody's awake there. Hopefully you caught that error. Um, these next two, and I want you to think about the programs that you have in place already in your school. Okay, is there any element of a positive behavior approach or a restorative approach? Because what we want to do first and foremost, as especially school leaders, is identify what are the foundational pieces that we might already have that we can build on. Okay. So if you have a positive behavioral approach or any restorative practices, that's a great stepping stone. Okay, and lastly, this big piece is that the responsibility for students is with all parties. So that's classroom teachers, that's other staff members, school nurses, cafeteria workers, bus drivers. Everybody needs to have a sense of commitment to the students. Okay, it decreases the level of stress for all members involved. The other piece that's important to note here is that we want to send the message to every single adult that interacts with a child that they don't need to be a mental health counselor. They don't even need to know what the trauma that a child is experiencing is or was. Really, you're going to see as we move forward that relationships are foundational. So if a student has a relationship, a first name relationship with the bus driver and a cafeteria worker and a school security guard, all of that contributes in a positive way to helping them deal with trauma. Okay. So what do? We want to dive in and start making some changes. So I love this image because everything up here, the iceberg, is what we see and we respond to. Okay, so in most cases, oftentimes in schools, this is our reaction to a negative behavior, to kids not showing up for school. It's reactive. But all of this is the work that needs to be done to create this trauma responsive school culture. And so all of this is really being intentional and being proactive. So, what are the systems and structures in my school? What are the policies that either support or can add to the problem? What are the attitudes and the beliefs? Okay, the attitudes and the beliefs basically form the foundation of your school culture. So if we can do that work to change some of those attitudes and beliefs, you will see a shift in what's happening day to day in your school. Okay, certainly the system structures and policies need to follow, but it usually starts with those attitudes and beliefs. So let's see, we're going to dive into 3 specific areas that you can start thinking about. Okay. The first one is making sure that your school is a safe place. Okay. And so what does that look like? It shows up in 3 ways. So we have to be free from harm. We have to have physical safety at school. So that means that there are no threats of violence from peers or staff or any member of the school community, that your physical safety is paramount. Okay. Second is your psychological safety, that students and staff members feel protected from any derogatory statements or anything that's going to negatively affect one's sense of self. So if we think about students that might be experiencing trauma, if you think back to those ACEs, there are things that fall within those categories that are stigmatizing. If a student shows up at school and other students know that this student's family has, a family member in prison, or there's been violence in the home, or anything like that, that is very stigmatizing. And so kids' psychological safety needs to be front and center. We need to be really clear that those things are not okay, that everybody should feel safe, and that there's not going to be that type of stigma or negativity. And lastly, emotional safety, right? So this way, you not only feel safe from harm, but you also feel supported. So this is the more positive piece, that you are supported and enabled. I love that word. I think that's important, because we want to make sure that you have everything you need so that you can take risks, so that you can make mistakes, so that you can fail and not have it negatively impact your self-esteem. Okay, and if you think about your own students, kids that maybe stopped coming to school after COVID, they had a hard time coming back. This is going to be critical before academics come into play at all. Just having an environment, a classroom environment where we celebrate learning that comes from mistakes. We really encourage and celebrate taking risks. So we praise effort, right? And we recognize all students' participation. Okay, so here are a couple of, I think, pretty simple takeaways that you can start in your classroom, whether you're a classroom teacher or school, if you're a school leader. Okay, so predictability and consistency. I give you an example here of what happens at the beginning of language arts, but you could think about this as whatever your role is. For example, you might have that the first 10 minutes in the morning is time to get ourselves grounded. And so we start with a morning message over the PA. We start with a yoga pose or a mantra or a positive saying, so that kids know every single day when I show up, I'm going to experience this, whatever that is. Okay. In this one, kids can predict when I come into language arts classroom, this is what's going to happen. Here's what I have to do. Here's what the teacher is going to do. Okay. That consistency is really key who have experienced those adverse experiences. Okay. What else? So we also have just that awareness of trauma responses so that teachers and anybody in the building can make their decisions based on their understanding of what trauma responses are, right? If I have a student in my classroom, like I mentioned before, and I start to see some behaviors happening and I understand it's related to trauma, then I might suggest that student go to a calm corner. Okay. If every classroom does not have room for something like this, you could set aside a place in the nurse's office or a teacher's lounge or the library that is a calm corner that students can go to. Or you could even do something like something that students can hold. Okay. But it's really that understanding and awareness of trauma responses that's going to drive any decision I make. And the third one here kind of piggybacks on what I was saying before about the opportunity to learn from mistakes. And that comes first and foremost as part of a school and a classroom culture. So even having verbiage like this in the hallways, in every classroom students go to, in this class, mistakes are expected, inspected, and respected, right? So not only do we expect them, but we're going to dive into them. So one of my favorite activities that one of my own kids experienced was a math homework, and this could be done as an activity in a classroom where there were problems that were wrong, and they had to identify what were the things that the student could do differently to get to a different result. Something like that. So we're not saying this is wrong necessarily, that this is a problem, that this is a mistake. What we're saying that this is, um, unfixable mistakes. What we're saying is this gives us an opportunity to do something different and to learn something new. That's an important message. In math, you'll often hear that referenced as productive struggle. Okay. This is really critical for kids, especially at the younger ages, because as they get older, they become much more resistant to wanting to take risks. Okay. So we're always going to do it in a safe space. Myself, as the educator, I always model it. So I will purposely make mistakes on the board, ask the students, invite them to share with me any kind of mistakes that I made, and we celebrate it and we talk about something that we learned from it. Okay. The next kind of pillar, the second pillar of a trauma responsive school culture is that it is relationship focused. So you heard me say this before that every person in the building is responsible for this work. And so we want every single person in the building, every adult, to adhere to these 6 bullets. And we'll talk about those in a moment. But every student should feel these 6 bullets from every adult they experience in the school. And so I think one thing that I would ask each of you to do is think about that and think about, if you're a school leader, does every adult in the building embody this? Do they embody a supportive, caring role? Are they engaging with students in a way that those students know that their identity and their interests are recognized? And that they may understand, the adults may understand any problems that this student is having outside of school. Okay, so these are critical. And I wanted to share this quote because to me, this is so powerful that a study was done, and that even having one better relationship with an educator at school can serve as a buffer to struggles and challenges that students may face. So how do we do that? We're all busy. How do we do that? And I see someone just raised a hand. So I want to go in and answer a question or, okay, I think Ellen, I think it was you that you raised a hand. Can you put your question in chat or in the Q&A? Because I saw you raised a hand, but I don't see the question. Okay, well, I'll keep checking back so I can see what your question is. But I think, oh, here we go. Okay. Isn't that pretty much resilience theory, having one caring adult in a student's life making a difference? Definitely. So I didn't use the word resilience today, but you will hear that word used in the trauma work. because absolutely one person can be that buffer or can be that um, reason why someone is able to form an effective response to stressors. Okay. And so, how do we do that? Because it's challenging with all the students we have and limited time. So, one of my favorite ways, it's called check ins. Now, you can do this in a classroom. A teacher can do it with every single student every morning. You can do it as a whole group. You can do it as an individual. But another way to do this is you can identify an adult in the building to literally take the first 3 to 5 minutes with assigned students. So it could be a guidance counselor. It could be, a PE teacher who's got morning duty. It could be anybody in the building. Okay. And they might be assigned 6 students, let's just say, that need that extra buffer. Maybe they don't have relationships that are helpful in the home. Okay. And maybe these students need more. So I'm going to give you 3 check-ins, but there's also a resource you're going to get after the workshop that has more. So I love this first one, the weather report. Many students don't have the language to tell you what's actually going on. And so they can just do the weather report. You could literally have this laminated and they come in. And keep in mind that as the adult, you will have to model this to start. And I think that's goes right to the heart of relationship building when you share that vulnerability and you model how do you express emotions. Okay. And this does not have to be a long activity. So that's the weather report. We also have high low. High low is when students share one high and one low. Why is this important? Again, you're getting kids in the habit of expressing emotions. In the beginning, it might all they might all feel low. And so it's your job as the adult to prompt them with some highs, right? By sharing your own. It could be that you wore something really comfortable today, or it was sunny out and you just love having the sun shine into your classroom. It doesn't have to be some knock it out of the park, but you do want kids to be able to start making those distinctions. The last one, feeling faces. This can be done with little kids, using different emojis or different, just in general, different characters that have different faces. We have a funny one that we do here with pictures of a sloth. So where they look very silly or angry or happy. But again, it's getting kids into the habit of tapping into their emotions and being able to then directly connect those emotions with how the rest of their day is going to be. So this generally happens at the start of the day. Okay, so far we have, it is a safe place, a trauma responsive school. It is relationship focused. And our last one is it embeds SEL in daily practices. Now I will say our time is beginning to wind down. So before I dive in, I just want to let you know that at Inspired Instruction, we have multiple workshops that will dig into this much deeper. And so we have workshops on trauma, but we also have workshops on SEL practices. So I just want to make that known because we're not going to be able to cover too much. But keep in mind, this is the third pillar, that SEL is embedded into everything we do. So we will have explicit SEL instruction and routines. We will have integration of social emotional learning in with our academics. So when we're reading literature that has characters, we're thinking about their emotions or their ability to make decisions. When we're reading informational text, when we're in math and social studies and science. Okay. And then finally, we have a responsive behavioral approach. Okay. And on the right-hand side, you see these are Castle's 5 competencies. And I think these are another one of those critical pieces that you can share with your school team. And they should be thinking about, okay, what might this look like for my grade level? And how am I working on these things, right? How am I working on social awareness or responsible decision making? Okay. Just want to see if we have any other questions. I know this is a lot of information and I appreciate everybody's questions. Okay, this last piece, responsive practices. So you see here, I have 12 different practices. And so I'm just going to touch very briefly in the amount of time that we have. But I want you to think about what is it that you are currently doing and what is one or two things that you can add into the daily practices of your school. This could be school-wide, this could be just in a classroom. But I've categorized them for you into two columns, preventative and in the moment. Okay, so what are we doing in real time when something happens? And what is preventative, kind of intentional that we can plan for to do this hard work? And I also saw someone's hand just raised. So I'm waiting to see if I get a question. Okay. And while I'm waiting for that question to come in, I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing what some of these are. Some are super simple. Okay. We talked before about predictability and consistency. And I want you to think first about Monday mornings. What is your school schedule on a Monday morning? Think about the fact that kids might be coming from a home life that maybe is unpredictable and has no routine. Okay. They might be off their game on a Monday morning. And so we really want to consider, is there any way that we can do some social emotional work first thing Monday morning or journaling, something to help kids kind of settle in and not go with the most challenging subject of the day in the first 15 minutes. Okay. Similarly, I love this idea of low and slow. And what this means is your tone of voice. This could be all of the time. It could also be times of the day that you know are triggering for students, or again, days of the week, but where you keep your voice on an even tone, that we're not raising it to get kids' attention. We're using some other signal, and that we're speaking in a slower mode. Okay, in general, this is found to keep kids more even keeled. Okay, so that's another pretty easy one. Brain breaks. We've been hearing about brain breaks for years, but they do specifically come into play for students with trauma, because it gives them that ability to, especially if they're physical, to get in touch with their body. Okay, if you can do something where there's movement or where there's stretching or a yoga pose and they're able to get in touch with their body and kind of recenter, that can be really calming and also help with that readiness to learn. Okay. Teaching emotional literacy. So those check-ins are one way to do it. But if you're not doing them as a whole class, there's lots of other ways that you can embed words other than just happy, sad, mad, right? And having that handful, really helping kids tap into, maybe they're feeling lonely or disappointed. So you can have an emotional word wall or an SEL word wall. Again, when you're doing a literature study, you can have students pull words that describe the emotions of the characters. But we need to be intentional. This is a quote unquote preventative method. You're preventing behavior issues by having kids have tools that they can access. It doesn't mean they're not going to experience their trauma or re-experience their trauma, but they're going to have some tools. Okay, certainly mindfulness, we know the effectiveness. We're sharing some resources with you. And then self-regulation behaviors. So you as the educator, can you model or do a think aloud when you are feeling frustrated, overwhelmed? Say it's a fire alarm. Say it's that you're just back from an assembly and it was really loud and overwhelming. Name that for students and say to students, I'm feeling a little out of sorts right now. I'm feeling like I might need to take a minute, right? So I'm going to show you what I do. I would do some deep breaths. I might do a quick write, whatever that is, you're going to model that for students. And all of these can be very much thought out, or these can be in real time, right? Like I said, if you just came back from a fire drill, you doing this is hopefully going to prevent other students from having an outburst. Okay. And then here are 6 methods to deal with behavior in the moment. And I mentioned it before, and I'm going to say it again. What are those triggers? right? If I can dim the lights, if I can separate students and give some space, if I can identify whatever that trigger is, that's going to help deal with the behavior. And then the other piece is respecting boundaries. I'm sorry, I keep clicking that. If you know that a student doesn't want close touch, then you getting in their face when you're providing a consequence or trying to talk them down might not be the best way to go. So think about what boundaries might need to be um, in place in those moments. Quickly help. So why is this important? It seems like a no-brainer. Well, if you think about the way we're taught about behavior, we're often taught to ignore the behavior. And that might be true in some cases, but not when you have students experiencing trauma. We want to quickly get in there and try to bring the temperature down and de-escalate. Okay. I think this fourth one is really critical. We must teach alternative behaviors. Okay. Something happens and you say to a student, well, let's see, what else could you do right now? Could you choose to go to the calming corner? Could you choose to go see the guidance counselor? Could you choose to write in your journal? So you're going to want to offer them appropriate alternative behaviors. Okay. You heard me talk about a calm corner or a peace corner. It can be in the classroom or in the school. And finally, the peace technique. The peace technique gives students 5 statements. I included this in your resources. You can print it out and put it up as a classroom poster. You can give it to each student and they just walk themselves through when they're starting to feel out of control or dysregulated. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information in this 45 minutes, and I'm hoping that there were 1 or 2 things that you're planning to take back to either your school or your classroom. And so I think if you want to take a minute, I'm going to give you the evaluation if you wouldn't mind filling that out. I'm going to grab that for you. But while you're doing that, just think about what resonated with you. Was it the calm corner or the peace corner? Was it the um, knowing how it shows up, knowing the indicators? Okay, what are those 1 or 2 things you're going to start with? And then I also want you to consider if you're a school leader, what additional support does your team need? Because I have to be honest, this is not going to work with 1 person in the building doing it. It really does need to be an all hands on deck approach. Now, you can slow roll that out. This could be an initiative that year 1, you're getting your own leadership team on board, right? And then year 2, you're going to bring your teachers on board. So we're not saying you have to do it all tomorrow, but just keep in mind that your team might need additional supports. Okay, the additional resources. So what we do is we send a follow-up email. So that will go out, it should go out tomorrow. And in that email, it'll have the recording of today as well as the resources. So there should be at least 5 or 6 things that either I referenced or an additional resource. Okay, let me just quickly grab the, whoops, I stopped sharing. Let me just quickly grab the evaluation. Okay. So I'm going to just quickly grab that for you. Hang on 1 second. I always do this where I go out of I get the wrong thing. I need to grab you the links. Hang on 1 second. There we go. Okay. So here is the link. I'm going to put that in the chat. I would really appreciate as many of you as possible. If you wouldn't mind filling it out, it helps us to know what we can do more of and how we can do it better. And then, of course, future webinars. We'd love to offer topics that are timely and that are relevant to what you're experiencing in schools. So I just stuck the evaluation in the chat. I would appreciate if you filled that out. And I'm also going to hang out for a few minutes for question and answers. If you would like to unmute, feel free to do so, or I can answer questions that come up through the chat. I'm happy to stick around and do that. Okay. So I just want to thank you all for attending today. I thank you for putting in some of your questions. I see it says, R. Hutton, you raised a hand. Oh, I see. I have to allow to talk. I apologize. Okay, you can unmute. Did you want to ask a question? Okay, I think you put it in the
Okay.
queue. Oh, good.
I didn't get the link in my chat.
Of the evaluation?
Yes.
Okay, hang on one second. Let me grab it again. Sometimes that happens. It says hosts and panelists. So you should see it. Who can see the message?
Right now,
Oh,
what I
everyone. All right, let me try it again. How's that?
got it. Got it. There it is. Thank
Awesome.
you
Thank you
so
so much.
much.
And there's some more hands raised. So I'm going to Tanya Diaz. Did you have a question? I think you're muted still, so feel free to take yourself off.
Yeah, I was trying to get to the evaluation. I'm good now. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Oh, thank you for bringing that up because I didn't even realize it was on the wrong setting. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I'll hang out if anyone else has questions. Ellen, you had a question? Okay. Oh, Ellen shared. Oh, thank you so much for sharing your takeaways. So if you don't mind, I'll share it in case the other attendees are still here. Your takeaways were trauma-informed care requires adults to be self-aware and to regulate their own emotions. 100%. I feel like it starts there, right? If you have an adult that can't regulate, that's going to be challenging. In order for adults to be successful at number one, districts much do much better with positive, supportive leadership that does not bully staff or treat them unprofessionally or unkindly. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we saw in that first kind of critical foundational piece was psychological safety, right? The adults in the building must feel the same way. So that's a critical piece for any school that wants to embody this approach, is that all team members are treated with respect. And so everybody feels psychologically safe. So Ellen's asking about a copy of the PowerPoint. We don't share the actual slide deck, but you will receive a recording of the session today. Okay. And yes, the resources, Ashley asked, the resources will be emailed. So most likely tomorrow that will all go out. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation today. Really appreciate you coming. And again, I appreciate you sharing questions and your experiences. I hope everybody also has a lovely holiday. Did you have a question, Mr. Hutton?
No, I'm just trying to exit out.
Gotcha. Okay, have a good
Sorry.
one.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.